This video's gonna contain spoilers from the off, so I'm warning you now. Smile 2 has just been released in the cinema, and do you know what? I'm gonna say it. It was actually pretty damn good. I didn't expect this movie to build upon the first in a way that made it even better, but they managed to do so. Focused on a singer called Skye Riley, we saw that the Parasite was feeding off of her following her witnessing her high school friend Lewis being killed by it when it got bored of him. With there being a lot of moments within the movie that were hallucinations, and the ending being one that twisted things on its head and made us question what was actually real. Let's discuss what actually happened, what didn't, the Parasite, and who it could potentially move on to next. So let's get into it. Here is a review of Smile 2 and the ending explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The ending explained. The end of the movie pretty much twisted things on its head, and what it did was it tied it right back to a small detail that occurred in the first scene of the movie where Skye met Lewis in his apartment. When we look at the ending, when Skye thought that she had the ability to be in full control and kill the smiling entity by injecting something into her which would have stopped her heart and meant that the Parasite would have no longer had a living host and ultimately died, there was a twist where the Parasite made out like it was fading away. However, it brought Skye out of the faded state as she thought she was dying, and the Parasite said how none of it was actually real. The needle then faded out of her hand and the Parasite got closer to her. This showed us that pretty much everything that we saw taking place in the movie that was going wrong for Skye was inside of her head. Her mother wasn't dead. Gemma had never got back in contact with her until she was in the car when she received the phone call, and I'd even argue that the detrimental events that occurred, such as the charity gala and breaking down on stage, didn't even happen. This was because the tour went smoothly and she was on stage on the opening night. This all connects right back to the beginning of the movie, because when we first saw Skye, she messaged Lewis and received a response saying that she could head towards his apartment. But when she arrived there, he was confused as to why she was there. He didn't actually remember ever sending her a message, and he said that he'd had one hell of a week. This showed that he was in a blacked out state where the life that he was leading was pretty much stuck inside of his head, as his body was kind of on autopilot and being controlled by the Parasite. The Parasite was essentially showing this world to Lewis where he was just being tormented. This is what ultimately happened to Skye when the Parasite was feeding off of her. Morris, the person that promised to rid her of the Parasite, didn't actually exist, and it was just a glimmer of hope that was presented to her by the entity as a way of making her suffer even more. That's why Morris knew about all of the different people that the Parasite had killed over the years, because it was operating itself. There is an argument there for the first encounter being real when they were sat together in the bar, which could well be a possibility, and it only being the second time where he messaged her the location of the Pizza Hut where the Parasite was then projecting, as that was when it was technically in full control. When the Parasite told Skye that none of what was in front of her was real, Skye awoke in her actual body rather than inside of her head, and she was on stage on the opening night of her tour that the whole movie was building towards. It was whilst she was on stage where the Parasite revealed itself and it broke out of her skin, which was being presented in front of her. And from there, it went inside of her mouth and she basically bludgeoned herself to death with the microphone that she was holding. The Parasite was bored of feeding off of Skye, as we heard Morris say would eventually happen, and it was ready to move on to somebody else. What's interesting about this ending is the fact that Skye died in front of thousands of people, and many of them witnessed it happen. As we've heard, the Parasite usually infects the person that witnesses the infected person die, but because there were so many that were there, I feel like this means the Parasite almost has a selection of individuals to choose from, unless it can only go to the closest person. So if there's a sequel, I think it could start by being somebody from the crowd of the show before then moving on to somebody else. I, however, feel like the next movie could be a prequel. The fact that we heard that there were 8 people before Skye, it felt like a detail that was included because it showed that there was a large history to the timeline in that world. At least a part of the timeline that people know of. So I think it means that we're going to get a prequel focused on one of the 7 victims before the first movie. That's a direction that I feel like I'd like the series to go in. What was a hallucination in the movie? There were probably 2 different arguments to what was real and what wasn't. One argument is that everything that we saw going wrong for Skye was inside of her head and didn't actually happen, as it was all a hallucination that was being projected to her by the smiling entity whilst her body was on autopilot. An argument for that is the fact that we saw that her mother was still alive during the ending, and she made it on stage without any issues and through no loss of fans whatsoever. Everybody alongside her mother was also smiling, when in the past she'd caused massive issues for the both of them. It's difficult to think that she would have gone through all of what she did and had no consequences whatsoever. Another argument is that nothing after when she was in the bed of the wellness clinic was real, but moments before were. However, bits like Morris being shown to her would have been projections, and also Gemma and Paul. But the pushing of the woman and breaking down on stage would have been real, so it was more of a selected approach rather than just the entity projecting everything. When she was in the wellness clinic, that was where she believed that she killed her mother, and the demon truly spoke to her. So that could have been when it decided that it was going to take full control of her. Prior to that, the smiling entity could have wanted her to have ruined part of her life publicly and messed with her reality in small parts. But when she was in the clinic and eventually got out, it allowed the real version of herself to get to the point where she was ready to go on the tour, but inside of her head caused a lot of torment to her, and that was what we saw. I kind of like the idea that most of the movie was inside of her head as a projection and that she was just being played with, whilst all the while the parasite was allowing her to go through her day in a blacked out state. It's a more complicated approach, but I think it's also more haunting. My review of the movie. I thought this was the best sequel to a horror movie that I've seen in years. It had a great story at its core, the performances by the cast were really impressive and allowed you to connect to the characters, and the use of silence in this movie instead of sound was some of the best that I've seen in a long while. So much of this movie was silent, and it just allowed the dialogue to breathe, and the movie ultimately dragged us right into the world by making it feel like there was a level of intimacy there. However, it made the motif that would often be repeated cut through even more. It was such an unsettling, low droning noise that would play, yet it had the ability to cut through like it was a screech, and it would often make me jump. Something that I feel often gets forgotten in this movie, because the entirety of it was just so good, was the opening scene with Joel. It was shot in a way where it was made to be a single take shot, and it was just a continuously running scene for several minutes, where it really established the tone and had that level of intimacy there. The slight twist of Lewis being in the corner and watching it was something that I didn't expect, and likewise with the death of Joel, that was a shock too. It looked absolutely gruesome, and I knew we were in for a bloody ride when that was the first few minutes. The movie did that on a few occasions. It made us think something would happen and then the opposite would. For example, we were watching the video that Lewis recorded on Skye's phone, and it always felt like something was going to jump out in the dark in his apartment. Instead, something jumped out in front of Skye as Lewis was projected to her. It was a small detail and decision, but I really respected it because it was unpredictable. The movie worked really well when focusing on contrast, whether that be light and dark, silence and then the loud motif, and also the world as we saw it, and it also being spun upside down. I feel like the shots of the city that would twist were just symbolic of the fact that all wasn't as it seemed, and the reality that we were watching unfold didn't actually exist in the form that we thought it did. I would really recommend watching Smile 2. It's rated 18 for a reason, and it's genuinely one of the best horror movies that's come out in recent times. It was stylistic, the performances were top tier, and it actually made me jump. It's a series of movies that I can get behind because it feels like they actually care about what they're creating, so I just hope they make a third one. So, there you have it, a review of Smile 2 and the ending explained. If you want to see more of your favourite TV shows and movies broken down, then click on the card in the top corner, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. And finally, if you'd like to see what I gave this movie out of 5 stars, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. What did you think of Smile 2? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.